But first, the only way to avoid chronic incompetence and dishonesty in government is to track it down and expose it wherever it's occurred. That's why I'm so determined not to let the hotel quarantine catastrophe be swept under the carpet as a mere creeping assumption, as some in the Victorian government might want. Yesterday, while everyone was digesting Tuesday's budget, a letter was released retracting the earlier testimony of one of the key officials managing this crisis. I told you about this last night, didn't I? And I promised you I'd have more to say. Well, I do. Now, as you know, no one in the Victorian government, whether they're an elected official, a politician, anyone, no one seems to remember anything at all about who decided to engage the private bouncers who let the virus escape into the Victorian community and that have led to a second wave and nearly 800 deaths. Nor do any of them, the public servants, the politicians, none of them. They don't remember much, do they, about that critical day back in March, Friday the 27th of March, when the National Cabinet made the decision that all states and territories would quarantine travellers returning from overseas. For every other state, of course, this meant the use of police and the military, but as we know in Victoria, this never happened. And as a result, Melburnians tonight are still living through their 11th week now of stage 4 lockdowns. I've had 16 years inside the most senior levels of government, and I'm a lawyer too. And it beggars belief that these highly skilled and experienced officials have spent their whole professional working lives in meetings, keeping records, writing briefs, all the various checks and balances built into our system of democracy to record who makes what decision and when they make it, that not one of them, no one, can say who made the decision for Victoria to go it alone and use private security. Even though without a shadow of a doubt, this decision was clearly made between 1:16 p.m, when the then Victorian Police Commissioner asked the head of the Department of Premier and Cabinet whether police would be doing hotel quarantining, and 1:22 p.m, when the Commissioner told his federal counterpart, all good, private security will be handling this in Victoria. Now, it defies common sense to conclude, as counsel assisting to the Coate inquiry did in their closing statements last week, that a decision made sometime between 1 p.m, when National Cabinet concluded, and 3:15 p.m, when the Premier went out and announced what Victoria was going to do, that somehow this was a creeping assumption. 2 hours and 15 minutes creeping assumption? No. That is the intervention of a key decision maker. And frankly, it beggars belief that the hotel quarantine inquiry has not sought the incoming call records of then Police Commissioner Graham Ashton when he pointedly reminded the inquiry under oath that all he could give them was his outgoing calls. It beggars belief that the inquiry by former Justice Jennifer Coate is still refusing to recall both the Premier and the former Health Minister after Jenny Mikakos pointedly said in her resignation statement 10 days ago that she was, and I quote, that she strongly disagreed with the Premier's testimony to Coate. I don't think it could get more murky, more concerning, but it has. Now let me step you through what's happened and why it's so important. Back in August, before the Justice Coate inquiry had heard evidence, there was also another inquiry set up into this hotel quarantine debacle by the Victorian Parliament's Public Accounts Committee. On August 26, Victoria's Emergency Management Commissioner Andrew Crisp, he fronted that inquiry to give evidence, and he was closely questioned about the events on Friday, March 27, again the day that the National Cabinet decision to have quarantining of returning travellers and the establishment of Victoria's hotel quarantine all occurred. Under oath when questioned, Andrew Crisp said not once but 3 times that he was regularly briefing his minister, the Police Minister Lisa Neville. Here is his statement the first time. Andrew Crisp says, "I was regularly briefing my minister as we were working through that particular operational plan." And again, in testimony, here's Commissioner Crisp and I quote, "I briefed my minister regularly throughout the day with regard to how the plan was being developed and who was going to be taking responsibility for various parts of that plan." And again, the third time, here he is again, and I quote, "I briefed my minister regularly throughout that day as to what was planned." Not only that, but Minister Lisa Neville was herself part of that particular hearing. And even though she interrupted twice at different times, she never contradicted the 3 times that Crisp made that statement that on that fateful day, March 27, that he had briefed her continuously. Lisa Neville interrupted the testimony and the proceedings at other times, on other matters. But not once back on August 26 did Lisa Neville speak up and say that Andrew Crisp's evidence about her, involving her, the repeated briefings, not once did she say it was in any way inaccurate. Yet later, in response to questions received from the later Coates inquiry, a fortnight after this August parliamentary inquiry met, Minister Lisa Neville wrote in her statement to Justice Coate that, and I quote, "Apart from the 2 p.m. meeting, I did not receive any briefings or have any discussions between 27 and 28 March 2020, during which the proposed structure or lines of accountability for the hotel quarantine program were discussed." Now, this is very, very important. When I read this Coate inquiry statement last week from Lisa Neville, I was surprised to see her say that she didn't get briefings from her emergency management chief. Now, I've been there in crisis times in government. I was there when there were terror attacks. I was there when we sent troops, Australian troops, to fight Islamic State overseas. So I know in a time of crisis in government, you are briefed almost every hour of every day. And this, of course, was when Victoria was in, and still is in, a formal state of emergency. So when she said no briefings, and I read it, my radar went off. More importantly here too is that under Victorian law, regularly briefing the minister is in fact a requirement for Andrew Crisp, the Emergency Management Commissioner. Not a nice to do, not a ministerial kind of code, friendship picked up, yes, we'll get along, let's brief her. No, no, no. A legal responsibility under Section 32 of the Emergency Management Act 2013. And I quote again, to ensure the minister is provided with timely and up-to-date information in relation to the response to major emergencies. So in changing his earlier testimony, which conforms with the minister's later testimony, the Commissioner, Andrew Crisp, seems to have put himself at odds with his own legal duty under this Act. But it gets worse. Not only has Crisp written to the Parliamentary Committee formally trying to retract what he said on the record 3 times, of course, then what he said on the record 3 times was not contested in the room by the Minister Lisa Neville at the time, but according to a report in the Australian newspaper today and corroborated by a number of MPs that I have spoken to this morning and later on, earlier than retracting his evidence, Crisp tried to remove what was said from the Hansard of that meeting. Now that's critical, because changing what you said might be considered generous, correcting the record. But trying to remove what you said is less a correction than a cover-up. And as any government insider like me knows, when someone tries to change the Hansard, well, that's an alarm bell as loud as a siren. Another bizarre feature of the letter from Andrew Crisp, again, let's remind ourselves, he's the emergency management head in Victoria, is that he cites the opportunity to review the transcript as the reason for now wanting to make these changes. But reviewing the Hansard transcript would have happened in the 24 hours or so after the August 26 hearing. Yet it's now only 6 weeks later that he's written to formally withdraw what he said so clearly and so definitely, not once, but 3 times. Now, as you'd expect, Liberal members of the Parliamentary Committee are now seeking to have Commissioner Crisp recalled, but that's unlikely, given the chair of the Parliamentary Committee is a Labor MP. And this then, yet again, is where the Justice Coate Board of Inquiry must lift its game. Here is yet another pressing reason for the Coate Inquiry to reopen its investigation. Not only are there missing phone records from former Police Chief Graham Ashton, not only is there disagreement between the Premier and a key minister, but now there's this key official changing his testimony and including, very substantially, his legal responsibilities under the Emergency Act. For the Board of Inquiry not to take further action would be an absolute travesty. Is it about truth or a smokescreen? We'll know soon enough, won't we? I tell you what, I am not going to give up and I am not going to go away.